Ah, my first memories were living on the hill in Vallejo, across the street from Mare Island, across the bay from Mare Island, in 1943 or something like that, 42, World War II. And these people all worked at the shipyards. We lived in a section of housing, for government housing, for people who worked in the shipyards out in Mare Island. And you got there by going on a ferry. And my dad drove the bus because he broke his ankle when he was breaking horses when he was a kid. He landed on a railroad track across the fence off of breaking when he fell off a horse. Cracked his ankle, and he always wanted to go in the war, but he couldn't because he couldn't move that ankle after a while, you know. He had trouble with that all of his life. So I remember wearing a soldier suit that my mom made for me. Little tiny shoulder seat and walking around, being the big time, because I was the only one who had a soldier suit. This is World War II, of course. And I remember that. I remember them, I remember blackouts. That's one of the first things I remembered, because at night we had to close all our curtains, and all the curtains had thickness in them, you know, like drapes kind of stuff. And I remember staying at a babysitter's, and my mom worked all the time. All the time I was ever worked, mostly full time. And I remember staying at a babysitter's and being at night scared because when it was blackout time, we closed all these things, and you know, we were worried about the Japanese coming and bombing, because we were in the San Francisco Bay, where they were building shipyards, the big ships of the Pacific at Mare Island. I remember that. What else did I remember that? Oh, yeah, I remember I heard one night they said, and this was come over the radio, what do they call them? What do they call those things? Air raids. We used to have practice air raids, and there'd be sirens on the corners ever so often. And they'd go off, and they'd tell you that they're going to go off on Thursday because we have to practice them, you know, because we were worried about the Japanese coming and bombing, which they did in Goleta. They did it with I read later, with a submarine. They bombed in Goleta there because they thought that was a big oil field. You've seen that little oil field there. But the war. One of the things that happened at that time that I remember, and I'm not sure how it all fits in, but it was Mare Island, and we moved during the end of that school year. I wasn't in school, but we moved because I went to kindergarten in Wyoming. But during that year sometime, there was an air raid that was not a practice. It came over the radio, this is not a practice. And I remember that. I remember being under a dining room table, which wasn't ours, but it must have been the babysitter. And it was a big round, the old style, it was great big thick stuff, you know, on the top of the oak. And I heard bombs. And now I'm in the war. I'm in the war now. I'm in an air raid, was a real, and I'm underneath the table with my sister and my mother. My folks aren't there. It's at night, and I'm hearing bombs. I was scared to death. All of us were scared to death. You know, you were scared anyway because of Pearl Harbor, but this was, and then one huge bomb, and then it was over. And I said, okay. Well, they never said anything about it because you're in a war and you don't give your enemy any information. So you never put that in. It's like battles like in Iwo Jima and stuff like that.
Well, maybe those were depth charges.
Well, wait a second, I'll tell you. But in battles in Iwo Jima, you heard about the results of them a month later because you didn't put that stuff right away, you know, because it's like giving them information to the enemy. And I found out later that there was they used to have subs that were just solidly packed with bombs and stuff in it from the Japanese. And they were always trying to get into American situations, you know. But they really want to get into the bay because that's where they could do more damage. And they had nets underneath. This I heard about later. I didn't know about it when I was a kid. They had nets underneath the Colgate Bridge. And these little tiny subs, if they could work it right, could get through there. And one got through, and it was on its way to Mare Island. And they bombed it until they got it. I don't know how they bombed it. You know, depth charger, and they never said anything about that. But they did get it, and they displayed it after the war, so you could see what they looked like, you know. And it wasn't in too good a shape after that, pieces of it, you know. But that was my touch of war, you know. Mom talks about seeing German prisoners out, you know, working in her fields. That was her touch of war. Mine was listening to bombs, and knowing from then on, this wasn't what we played in the toy soldiers, which we loved to do, and win every battle. This was somebody's going to die, and then I started thinking about what my mother would tell me what those stars were, because there was a white star on a blue field whenever someone was killed from your family in the war. So we'd be driving, going someplace, and you'd see a star.
What was the gold star?
Huh? I don't know. I don't know what color it was. But it was a star that told you somebody died, and that meant war again. You know, we moved into the interior. We lived it. Things fell off. But anyway, we moved into the interior where there was, the war wasn't a big deal because you're in Wyoming or someplace, you know. But when you drove around and I walked to school, to kindergarten, and see a star, a new star would show up and say, somebody died. And usually it's a man. Very few women died in the war, so, and there are a lot of women that died, but comparatively. And one thing you realized that I didn't know the percentages is that at that time, at that war, 25% of the population was in the war. The male population was in the war. Do you want to research this?
The impact you feel today.
Oh yeah, hugely.
Tell us about.
Well, let me finish that, Mark, just thinking.
Oh, okay.
The thing that did, especially Pearl Harbor, was nobody was against the war. Before that, I was told, I didn't know, there were a lot of naysayers about going to war. You know, they want to go over to Europe and fight somebody else's war. Does that sound familiar? And Pearl Harbor came, and all the naysayers were gone. Everybody was patriotic. I mean, it was hugely patriotic. If you didn't black out your curtains, somebody would come over from your neighbor and tell you about it. This is the war, and we are all in this war. And when you go to the movie, it was all in the war. You heard more about that. And the war was everything in those days. Rationing. You couldn't buy, you only buy a certain set of tires for your car. And the rubber was going to the war on both sides. And so you could get a certain amount of tires, and then you wore them. And then that's when they started having, what they call it, retreads. It's the first time you ever saw retreads, because they take the whole base of the tire and only put rubber on the outside again. And then you ran those again. And we had shoes, were all leather soles. You couldn't have rubber soles.